Hello, and welcome to Bookish Haze, a podcast where we get to talk about two of our favorite things, Taylor Swift and reading. I'm Katie.
And I'm Sameen, and every episode we're going to take a book or series and analyze the characters as they relate to songs across Taylor Swift's entire discography. Welcome back to Bookish Haze. This week we have a really special episode. Katie and I were trying to think of how we could do blind date with a book because that just always seems like such a really fun idea. But the problem is that we both live on opposite sides of the country, and it's really expensive to one, buy books in general, and two, mail them across the country. That just didn't really feel particularly sustainable. So what we did instead was we mailed each other little cards. And so we still had to wait for snail mail to come through and see what book each of us had.
Yay. Super exciting. Full disclosure that Sameen and I did not get each other's snail mail in time. So you can tell how often we send letters, but we do love the post office, so support your postal worker.
Now, on the count of three, what we're going to do is, if you're watching this on video, you will get to see the book, and if not, we will name them in just a moment.
Do you want to start with yours, Sameen?
For sure. Mine is Beautiful World, Where Are You by Sally Rooney.
Yeah, I totally kept thinking Great Big Beautiful World.
What is Great Big Beautiful World?
It's nothing. It's Great Big Beautiful Life by Emily Henry, which is coming out, combined with Beautiful World, Where Are You? So I kept getting them mixed up because I was like, what am I trying to say? And I had to keep making sure I didn't write the wrong one.
I guess it's good to know at the end of the day the world is beautiful.
True. And mine is Hood Feminism by Mikki, Kendall, which has been on my bookshelf for a few years. So I feel like this was an actually really good pick because it is nonfiction and not something that I would reach for that often, even though I do have it and did want to read it. So
amazing. Well, do you want to start out by telling us a little bit about the book?
Sounds good. Okay, so Hood Feminism is, I'll just read the full title, which is Hood Feminism, Notes from the Woman That a Movement Forgot. And I guess the book's a collection of essays about different topics, and how white feminism has failed and how they're not advocating for issues that actually matter to most people. But I definitely had a different impression going in, just in the sense that I bought this book a few years ago. I think I read the summary, but then totally forgot and didn't reread the summary. And I thought it was going to be more about how, in this case, a Black woman interacted with feminism and how she was showing up in her communities. And so it was that, or basically minority communities have to show up for themselves and support themselves for basic needs. But it was just a different perspective going in. So it was really interesting and not at all what I expected.
That makes sense. So it's a lot about just the concept of intersectionality, but you were saying that it's not quite the story and the line that we would normally hear about intersectionality?
Yeah, totally. Definitely talks a lot about intersectionality. I think it focuses a lot about how feminism right now in the day and age obviously focuses a lot about there's the Me Too movement and a lot about women in the workforce, or at least that is what I've seen, my impression of it, and how ultimately that is great and obviously still important movements and things to consider, but you really need to start lower and focus on having feminism in the basic needs survivability. So I'm gonna read the first sentence or first few sentences from the summary, but it says, today's feminist movement has a glaring blind spot, and paradoxically it is women. Mainstream feminists rarely talk about meeting basic needs as a feminist issue, argues Mikki, Kendall. And I just thought that summed it up pretty well, which is I had never really heard or thought about feminism in that way, and how ultimately I think the way these essays are set up are, here's a topic, let me introduce you to it, and kind of give you some background context, and then here is how it is not talked about in mainstream media and by white feminists and why it's important for them to do it. But it's just something that it makes total sense. There's the whole Maslow hierarchy of needs, and the very bottom are your survivability, basic needs, where you can kind of advance up. But yeah, again, it's one of those glaringly obvious things that I just was not educated.
So is it correct to say before we can focus on feminism as a whole and outside of that space, we need to focus on first having livable wages? Or is it even before we get into livable wages and the pink text and all of that, is it just feminism starts where you are just literally treating your treating women in your family well and everyone is equal within the household and expecting, is it like, does it go back to that kind of that statistic that like women tend to do like, what is it, like 150% of that housework, even though they still have their jobs?
That is a good question. I think it's not saying any of that directly. Like that, I think like was
Okay.
definitely like mentioned in relation to like some of these other topics. But I think the focus was more around like, let me just read you some of the like chapter titles to give you an idea of like what was talked about. So like one was like reproductive rights. One was about Black girls don't have eating disorders, the fetishization of fierce. And so it was kind of like how there's a bunch of ways, like, because this is a Black woman, like she focused it mostly on like herself and then like kind of talked about other communities as well, but about how like, for example, Black women are considered like fierce, and like when they are angry it's considered aggressive, and how that's portrayed in the media, and how like white feminists often are oppressing Black women or like, you know, other minority communities because they are not doing the work to like stand up and support these Black women when they are being called aggressive. And so it was like very interesting because I think a lot of the topics were it wasn't like necessarily applied simply to like feminism, like obviously support systems for, you know, like children who are in the inner
Yeah.
cities, like that is just like a general topic. It's not like feminists only need to like focus on it, but I think the idea behind that is like this is a topic that feminists don't talk about at all, like they're not thinking about. And as it is like a powerful community is not the right word, but like a powerful force, like feminists should be focusing on those because they're able to like use their voices, especially like those who are more privileged, if that makes sense.
I think so. So like looking at feminism as equality versus just like for women, which is I think what it's supposed to be anyway, but the white feminist movement kind of like takes from that sometimes.
For sure. But yeah, I think it was really good. I definitely a collection of essays about different topics. And I think there's a lot of value about like reading it,
Mm-hmm.
not like I did, which was like over a week, not binging it, but just like, you know, getting through it so I could talk about it on the podcast. But like maybe reading one chapter a month, sitting with it, like doing some more research. Because what I didn't realize until the very end, there was a lot of comments and like anecdotes that were shared that I was like, where are the sources cited for this? Because I would have loved to like learn more about it. And the author did include like a bunch of them at the end, which I really like. Yeah, I think it's like it's a lot to take in and a lot of topics covered. So like reading it over a span of a while and like I said, like sitting with it would definitely be beneficial.
Yeah, I imagine it was pretty heavy just to begin with also.
Yeah, totally. I'm trying to see. I like took some notes while I was reading through it. Oh yeah, the other interesting thing, which is like again why I think this book was like really good, is that because it covered like a wide range of topics and some things that you like might not even think about, or just like not like as prevalently shared like in media or, you know, whatever. But there was like definitely times I had to check my own bias in the sense of like I would read something and be like, I haven't like experienced that before. Like, oh, that's interesting. Like, I didn't know that. And then like have to sit with that and be like, okay, like what are they actually saying? Like reread it a few times, and be like, oh yeah, that's just like I forget what they're called. Oh, implicit. That's the word. I was like implicit biases that are coming through. And yeah, there's actually like an anecdote that she shared in one of the essays about like a white woman who was in a class, I think, about the psychology of sexual harassment. And she like got called out for some of her opinions. And I think it was a little bit of like, yeah, those implicit biases of like, this is my narrow viewpoint of the world and like my experience. Like I haven't had someone tell me that happen. So it just like it's really good to like read about, I don't know, just like all the different topics and broaden my horizons and my understanding.
Yeah, that's valid. I feel like it's really hard to believe certain things and understand certain things when you haven't experienced it. And that's like where empathy comes in. But empathy is sometimes really hard to find and really hard to muster. And sometimes you think that you're being empathetic, but the reality is that like it's not in the way that is useful for, especially when it comes to like just any kind of movement.
Yeah.
But did you have anything else that you found, any other essay in particular or story that you found like really resonated or like particularly broadened that horizon?
I really like the title was "The Hood Doesn't Hate Smart People," and it was essentially kind of around how like there are a lot of children growing up who might be like really smart, But because they don't have like the same resources as some other person, they might have to take care of their family, and so they can't, go on to college or like higher education because they need to like drop out. And generally, I think the kind of like story she was telling was like join a gang or like do some more illegal behavior. And I think it was interesting, kind of the concept that like I think the narrative that gets put out a lot is that like, oh, these people are bad, they are doing illegal things, like we should punish them. But it's again like kind of a framing thing of just like a lot of times these people don't have the choices. And so not that she was advocating for like violence or like doing illegal things, but like it's not so black and white and like cut and dry, right? Of like these people are in a gang or doing drugs because they are bad people and like just want to do that. Which I again knew, but I think just the way she like framed it throughout like the whole book and all the essays was really good.
I think that's valid. I think it sounds a lot like I forget which Malcolm Gladwell book it is, and like honestly, he's not a vibe. And there was a lot that was missed from that as well. I think that his perspective was very much the narrow kind of like not quite white feminist perspective, but it was definitely like a very narrow worldview that his books are kind of written in. But that being said, like there is that concept, no matter where you look at it, where there's just like the way that you grow up. And in particular, I'm thinking about the book where he was talking about like people's IQ and like being born a genius is one thing, but being able to like nurture that genius is an entirely different thing. And just the concept of like, even when you look at the college admissions scandal and you just see how like privilege makes such a massive impact, and it's small privileges too, right? Like you read stories, and there were a couple of essays in articles and things like that about like people who work day in day out and had to like figure out how to get themselves a laptop to get through school, working all of these different jobs, and you're like, wow, like they have done so much more to have earned their way. And even then, you've really just earned your way to a space where you then have to work twice to three times as hard as someone who already had that privilege. And it's like, it makes sense. It's not necessarily advocating violence, but it's like, okay, but understand why the violence is happening. Like if you brought in more of the equality, if you used the space to like bring in not like necessarily full-blown socialism, but yeah, if you enacted some socialism and not full-blown capitalism all the time, maybe we would have communities that can feed themselves and people who didn't have such desperation and like such like need to turn to options that aren't ideal.
Yeah, no.
And I say that from my, place of privilege here. So
yeah, totally. That was like, I think the way these essays were written were like, did a good job of like acknowledging her privilege, and like it really made the reader, I think, confront their privilege or think a lot more about what privileges they might have, but not in like a, you should feel awful about yourself, you're an awful person for like having these privileges, but more just like, yeah, thinking about the advantages that you might have had that, again, kind of are used to, so you don't necessarily like appreciate them or think about them as often. Like, for example, like I think she said she has written 2 books and like college educated, and she had not necessarily like the like ideal home life, but always had like her aunt or her grandma or grandparents like to help take care of her, and like she didn't have to like drop out of school to like take care of an ailing parent or like a sibling or something like that. And so like because of that, she was able to stay in school and continue on to higher education, whereas like she had given some stories, I think, of some other classmates where it was like the exact opposite. Like this classmate's like their parent was checked out and he had like a younger sister, and so like he needed to figure out some way to like pay rent and like have income so that he could take care of his sister, and that turned into like or like joining a gang and then like dying, I think, like she said, before 30, which again goes back to why didn't they feel they need to do that. It's because of these food deserts or not having equity across like what services are available, or like taking away all the social services and stuff.
Sounds like a really fascinating book.
It was good. Yeah, I think there's a lot of good quotes for it, lots of things to unpack, and would probably do a reread and just pick like chapters to read about and like talk about with someone or talk it through, because like I think when I was reading it I was like, this is so much information, I don't know if I like fully grasped what they were talking about or like remembered what they were talking about, because there's so many things coming at you. But I think like just talking about it out loud, and I'm sure I've like misspoken a little bit, but it's like, yeah, you just absorb a lot more than you realize.
Nice. What would you rate it out of 5?
I rated it a 4, mostly because
Okay.
I think some of the chapters like got a little lost, where they would like talk about a topic and then kind of like go off on a tangent and then like recenter eventually, but sometimes it made it hard to like fully grasp what was being said. I wish that I'd known there was like resources at the back, because there was definitely a few times that I was like, this seems kind of like you made this generalization and like don't have any resources to like back that up. So I like didn't trust it as
Cite
much.
your sources.
Yeah, like when I was first
Yeah.
reading, like not necessarily about like her experience or like the Black community as much, but like she would bring up like other people of color, disability, like trans people. And I was like, it feels like you generalize this to a bunch of communities that I'd be curious to know like why you made that jump. So, but I'm sure, like I said, the resources were at the back. The book seemed heavily researched, so I assumed they were there. I was just surprised that there was no citations.
That's really fair. Cite your sources.
Yeah.
They're important.
Anyways, that was my book. What did you think of Sally Rooney? Actually, first, give me some background on your experience with Sally Rooney, if any.
Okay, so I will say I think this is like the second book of Sally Rooney's that I've read.
Okay.
The first one was Normal People, and I'm like 80% sure that I watched the TV show, movie, whatever it was of it. I think it was a TV show. But I could like see it pretty clearly, like what was happening. I feel like she writes it well enough that I'm like, that movie that plays in my head when I read books was like really playing well. I think this one in particular, I did like it a little bit more than Normal People. I think what I run into with many Sally Rooney books, and in particular with this like Beautiful World, Where Are You book, was just this concept of like, if I feel like I got it, then it's like a little bit pompous. And if I feel like I didn't get it, I'm like not smart enough. And it's a weird place to be. Also, I will say that I started reading this book after a therapy session. So one, speaking of that privilege, and two, it was a really funny place to come in from to read this. Hopefully, if you're listening to this, you have read the book, but for anyone who hasn't, it's basically a story about Alice, her best friend Eileen, this guy that she meets named Felix, and a guy who has been Eileen's friend named Simon. And basically the four of them are like in their 20s, early 30s, and they're just like doing life. And I think this is like my genres of choice are very much fantasies and rom-coms. And this is like, I don't know, I feel like the genre might be fitting under like literary fiction.
Yeah.
You know, and it like very much felt like literary fiction. It took a while to get to the point, but it was like, okay, like, yeah, the beautiful world, where are you? It's everywhere around you is kind of like the point of the book, from what I understood. But like I said, I feel like if I got it, then it's a little bit pompous. And if I didn't, then I'm just not smart enough. I do think that it was better written than Normal People.
Okay.
I will give it that. And I really did want to root for the characters a lot more than I wanted to root for people in Normal People. Like, I think Normal People was a little bit odd. I will say also that like when I was reading this, it was like Alice and Eileen and Eileen's friend Simon, they were all like intellectualized in a way. I don't really know how to explain it. Like the characters just felt intellectualized. And then Felix was like distinctly not supposed to be that at all. And he was like the most normal person there. But also like 90% of the book, I just kind of sat there and I was like, please just like talk to each other. Have a conversation with each other. Like be more outward. There were a lot of times where Alice was like, oh, I don't want to pry. Like, it's not my place to ask. But she'd be referring to like something that was personally happening to like her boyfriend or her best friend. And it was like, I feel like in those situations, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like maybe it's okay for you to pry. Like, I feel like this is the place for you to pry. And like establish that human connection that people need. And maybe that was the point and I was just missing it because I like really overshare. But those are my initial thoughts.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I think it's hard sometimes to tell if an author has made a choice intentionally, like, and we're supposed to like interpret it that way, or if their writing is just that and they're, like you said, like trying to write these intellectual characters that do come across like kind of as pompous. Because I've had that experience with authors too, and I'm like, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But it is good that you think her writing has gotten better, because this is probably like her fourth book or something.
Sure, I believe
yeah
that.
like so hopefully your writing has gotten better. Yeah, I'm curious to know, because you said that you wanted to root for them more than you did at Normal People, but did you end up like rooting for them? Like, did you like the resolution? I guess, did you like their relationships between each other?
Yeah, I think so. I think the resolution was great. It was all wrapped up really nicely in a bow, which we know how much I love that. I think the 2 books that I read, people are very detached from their reality, which is completely valid. Yeah, I don't think most of us are particularly attached to our reality, and it was really funnily written because the book was like, obviously it focused on like Alice and Eileen, and you could kind of like tell that those were like the 2 POVs that we were getting most often. But the narrator was also like, it was funny because I feel like the narration pulled away from the beautiful moments. So we would get like really into like, we would know the specificity of what was happening in moments where like the couples were not getting along, but some of their more like kinder, tender, intimate moments were pulled away. And it was really funny how it happened because it's like you almost didn't expect, like you weren't looking for it to happen, but you also kind of notice the loss when you see the uglier moments surface, if you will.
Okay.
Which I thought that was really interesting. And then I really liked that like every other chapter you kind of got an email back and forth between Alice and Eileen, which one is hilarious to me because it was definitely set in like today's world. But it was also just like, I was like, who is emailing these long letters to their friends? Like even these like little snail mail letters you and I sent to each other were so short. Also, can you imagine like not texting back and forth every day, but just like emailing, like, here's everything that happened during the last time,
No, literally.
like since the last time we corresponded. And I'd be like, I literally can't even remember what happened. Which I guess on that note, I think the other piece about like rooting for them was just like, it was funny because there were specifically moments with like Simon and Eileen where both of them would like, I think there was one where I think Alice had asked Eileen, like, does he love you? And she responded and she was like, no, he likes me as a friend or something else. And I was just kind of sitting there and I was like, but literally, not even a chapter before, he literally said to you, I love you multiple times. And it was really interesting because I was like, I feel like this is how you would expect to like interact with your friends. And maybe my friends and I just like share too much with each other. But like, I would get the entire story. I'd be like, here's what happened. Here's how it happened. And it was like really funny because there were a lot of stories that they told where it was like, here's like the smallest detail about like how he opened the door. And when he opened the door, this is where I was sitting. But then you like miss out those big details. And I'm like, I don't understand how you communicate with each other. I think that's where I stand. But it was really clear also that like a lot of their communication was impacted by like having depression, having anxiety, having low self-esteem, having in Eileen's case like a mother who just like was emotionally manipulative. Like that woman was terrible. And we got half a conversation between the two of them. And it was like the conversation was literally like, why is it that when my sister like says mean things to me, you say I'm going to step out of it, but when she says something mean to you, you get upset when I don't defend you? And her mom went off and was like, well, you think I'm such a terrible person. And I was like, wow, that was textbook emotional manipulation. Side note, Eileen's sister's name was Lola and she was the worst, but her name isn't Eileen. And I just really feel like those two names are from entirely different periods. And it was really fascinating to see like, you know, when people talk about like how your name kind of shapes your personality, it felt that way.
Interesting. Okay, that's funny that you say that because I feel like that gives me a good picture of like maybe how these characters or like what these characters are like without having read the book. So, okay, well, I've already given Sally Rooney, I think, enough chances. I don't think I'm going to read this one, but I did just finish Intermezzo, which was fine. It's also not my genre wheelhouse that often. So, you know, life's too short to spend time on books that we are not that interested in.
Also, our TBRs are too long anyway.
Also true. But yeah, sorry, back to the book. Would you say that there, like, the focus was a lot on relationships in general, or like the friendship between Alice and Eileen, or romantic relationships? Because it sounds like there was a lot of different things explored.
Yeah, it was kind of across the board. It was like all of these different types of relationships. I think it was like, and I think I read this somewhere too. It was just a book about being in your 20s.
Okay.
And maybe being like a little bit mentally ill. Which is
very
so valid.
Yeah,
we're
like,
all in our
on
20s
brand.
and a little bit mentally ill. Yeah. I was like, this is extremely relatable. But I think it was also just like, I understand that the relationships were not necessarily portrayed like in the most realistic way, because that's the way it is in books.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you're never going to get the dialogue, you're never going to get the relationships exactly the way that they exist in everyone's real life, because we all exist really differently. And I think there was also a moment of just like a little bit of sadness and like disappointment when you realize that like they're not entirely accurate, but they're not entirely inaccurate either. Like, I kind of wish that they were a little bit more inaccurate, because just the concept of like the way that Alice wears her heart on her sleeve, and she was not rejected by Felix, but also like not really loved and accepted by him initially. Like, he had a lot of his own insecurities that he like was projecting onto her. I did appreciate though that in that space, like, she put in a lot for the characters to like be like, these are my insecurities, and this is why I'm saying the things that I am.
Like, she helped create fully fleshed characters.
100%. And I think there was also like, maybe it's the word of the weekend, I don't know, but there was a lot of cognitive dissonance there. And I think that's really valid. Like, I think that people, especially when you are at this age, when we are in this world, it doesn't feel like you are always going to have non-cognitive dissonance. I think also there were a lot of moments where they just kind of brought up politics kind of just around, like in your periphery.
Okay.
One piece of it was like Simon does work in politics, but they actually just brought it up as like, we're having this conversation because it was news that happened and we were at this party, so we're chatting about it. And especially in the wake of American politics and what we've seen really recently, that felt really well done.
Okay.
And it kind of felt like it just came out of nowhere, but it was still very much on the periphery. Like, it's kind of that way where it just kind of like, it sits close enough to you that you feel unsettled, but it's not so close to you that you have to pay attention to it every day, and that it takes away from all of the goodness happening around you, which I think was also going back to that, like, because I was like, where is this, like, why can't you find your beautiful world?
Yeah, that's what I was gonna ask, was like if it was kind of added in there, like the politics specifically was added in there to kind of give that like tarnish to like the beautiful world message that was being sent, or if it was like used as a way to be like, despite, you know, politics, life is still beautiful.
I don't really know. I don't think that it was particularly clear there. There was also a moment at the end that was really funny where Alice, because she's a writer, was noting that like there was someone who like commented on an interview that she had done as a character, just about like how her partner had not read the books yet. And it was true, like Felix had not read her books because he just didn't want to read them. And the person, like the commenter on the internet, was like, I cannot believe this, like, you deserve better. And she was like, it's really funny how people just like really think that they know you, and can make these conclusions about you. And I was sitting there and I was like, that's really funny, because I'm literally about to go on this podcast and do the exact same thing to these characters, right? Like, so it's really hard. It's like, yeah, it's hard to figure out exactly why Sally Rooney put those in there. And I don't think that we're ever going to necessarily have the answer to that. But I think that it did enhance that kind of feeling of like, wow, this feels very much like the world that we are in.
Yeah. So two things. One, apparently Sally Rooney is like maybe a communist, or like has communist ties. I forget. My friend told me about this and I was like, what? But
Cite your sources.
yeah, like I'll send you some stuff. But I did not look into it because I was like, no offense, Sally Rooney, I do not care about you enough, and I'm not going to read your
Valid.
stuff. But I would be curious, I guess, like if maybe I should have sent you this earlier so you could read it, and then I'd be like, did you see any like communist elements in the movie or in the book? But moving on from that, the second thing I was going to say is, from what you're saying, it sounds to me like maybe this book like might have this, but would you say, like, it sounds like this book kind of had the element of like uncanny valley, where things were like very close to reality, but like something was just like not quite exactly how you might think it would go in real life?
I think to some extent, yes, but I also think that that has more to do with my own lived experience than it does her writing.
Fair.
And I think like maybe that's part of the point of it, right? Is just kind of sitting there and being like, yeah, like this is how it is in a lot of people's lives and in like a lot of friendships. I think that there was a lot of moments of just like, well, I wish you had told me these things out loud. And like I was saying before about like how it was funny because Eileen and Alice were like, we're best friends, but then they still didn't want to step on each other's toes. And I feel like that was a little bit more of like this uncanny valley piece that you're saying about just like it doesn't feel totally close to reality. But I also like understand that like for a lot of people that is somewhat reality. And there are like moments where you're like, I don't necessarily want to pry into my best friend's life on this. And I think that's where like your individual personality comes in and where the character themselves came in. And so I think it was a really good balance of like, it felt like it could happen in someone's life. It was just when it did, I was like, I wish you wouldn't.
Yeah. That makes sense.
And also there were like a lot of moments where I was like, this just sounds like it's reading like a rom-com, because I do want to throw my book across the room because you're both being idiots.
That's so funny.
I was listening to this as audiobook on my run this morning just to kind of like get to the end of it. And one, I'm really grateful that it was an audiobook. I think that listening to it made it just even better. The audiobook had a lot of like good emotions in it. Also, it was really funny whenever they would like switch characters and like put their voice down. And I think it just like helped to catch some of the dialogue, because without the quotation marks, the infamous lack of quotation marks in these books, it can be a little bit harder to follow. But it was just like, it's kind of funny at certain points, and I enjoyed it. It was good humor.
Good. Wait, so what did you rate it?
I think I'm somewhere around a 3.5 for this one, which was really surprising. At the beginning, I was just like, this is really grinding my gears.
Yeah.
Also, the way that Alice spoke was hilarious. Because she started out, there was like, I think the initial email or the way that she was speaking to Felix just from the get-go just sounded very formal. And it almost felt like it was like supposed to be from a different age. And then you find out that her upbringing was something where like, I think her parents both like did work, and it wasn't like full of a lot of privilege, because she yells at Eileen a little bit later about just like not being like upper middle class enough. And I think that that was kind of reflected in like, okay, and then she became this big shot author, and like everything changed for her, not overnight, maybe I can't really tell, but like everything kind of changed for her. So it like changed the way that she existed. And it was like, oh, it's really interesting, because she very immediately was like, I don't care what people think about me. And then proceeded to like, I think the way that she spoke was to make people think that she sounded smart and to make people believe that she belonged. Which again, to be fair, it was like, this was very much like a quintessentially you are in your 20s book.
No, I was going to say, it sounds a lot of like I feel like a lot of people our age like struggle with who I want to be and who I actually am, and like how I'm presenting myself. Like I say I don't care, but like I do care.
And it's one of those things too where I feel like I'm like, but if I care and if people know that I care, then that becomes too high school, and all of a sudden I'm too immature. But I can't be immature, but I am a little bit immature because I'm literally a baby adult.
Yes. Yeah, I have read a lot of articles about how we are very anxious people, and I think that is extremely true.
It's also reflected very well in this book.
Yeah, I'm sure. I was gonna say like one thing, going back to kind of the Uncanny Valley piece, and like how, like you said, they aren't your lived experiences, and I wonder how much of the fact that like Sally Rooney is like an Irish author like plays into it, and if that, I don't know what like Irish friendships are like, or like culture in Ireland is, but I have heard like, or just like read randomly that like UK people are typically more reserved or something like that, and so I wonder if that's like kind of mimicking what friendships look like there.
Yeah, there were a lot of moments where I looked at the book and I was like, this is so European. Like, this is so British. Not that the Irish are British. I want to clarify that this is not the case. But it was very much like, I see, it's like the emotional detachment. It's like the things that you would stereotypically see across the pond, if you will. And it's really funny because one of my friends does have a boyfriend who is British or Scottish, or combination of British and Scottish. And like one of the biggest issues is just like he does not open up and speak. And it's like, this is not an issue that's like unique necessarily to people that are in Europe. But also it is something that feels stereotypical. And I think that this book really reflected some of those stereotypes in a real good way. I think that if you enjoy Sally Rooney and you are interested in reading the book, I would give it a shot. I think that if you are fascinated by the story type and can withstand some of the like meta feeling of it, I would definitely recommend the book. But other than that, I think that it was well written. I think that there are a lot of moments where I couldn't really tell if something was there for symbolism or if it was just there because it was part of the story. And I think I kind of appreciated that. But it is also like a very slow book, and it's not a rom-com. So anyone who's looking for a fast rom-com, this is not it. I don't really know why this would ever be on your list in that case either. But
fair enough. Well, thanks everyone for joining. I hope you enjoyed this episode in this new format. Kind of our goal with this one was like, let's pick something for each other off of our TBR and also like books that we own. And I think they were both out of our wheelhouse, not genres we usually read, but it sounds like overall like pleasantly surprised with how much we ended up enjoying it. I think like Mikki Kendall, she even says like she does not pull punches. Like she is the one that like people come in when they don't want to be polite, but they want to pretend that they themselves are polite and can be like, oh yeah, that person is just like, you know, so rude, but like she's right. And so I think there's a lot of I wouldn't even say harsh truths, but like good truths delivered, good insight to Happy Had and Hood Feminism. And yeah, let us know if you've read either of the books, and we will see you in 2 weeks with our next episode. This one will be completely about a book, so no blind dates, but we'll be back in a month with new ones.
See y'all next time.
Bye.